just got a few more to go. Acts chapter 23. And I want to go back to the last verse in chapter 22, verse 30. But on the next day, wishing to know for certain why he had been accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the council to assemble and brought Paul down and set him before them. That honestly ought to be the first verse of chapter 23. This is the next phase of Paul's interrogation. The commander got a hold of him, because Claudius Lysias, because the Jews are upset because Paul is hanging out with Gentiles and he is giving the gospel to Gentiles, and they don't like it. And the reason they don't like it is Paul is not requiring the Gentiles to be Jews first. So there's a big uproar, and so the commander came out and wanted to know what was going on. Couldn't figure out why they were so mad. So in verse 30, the next phase of this is he's going to get the Sanhedrin together. And so starting in chapter 23, it starts Paul's defense before the Sanhedrin Council. Just to remind you, the Sanhedrin Council is a group of 70 scholars of Israel, kind of like the Supreme Court of Israel, religiously. They are made up of Pharisees and Sadducees. That is important because of what Paul's going to do in just a minute. Again, Paul's a pretty sharp guy. And so he's going to do something to kind of get the heat off himself. But starting in chapter 23, verse 1, he is going to begin this defense. Now, I don't know if you've ever really read these verses before, but look how this thing starts. Paul, looking intently at the council, said, "Brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day." So this is the way Paul starts it. He gives them this formal greeting, very respectful, calls them brothers, and he says, I'm by his manner of speech, calling them brothers, he's identifying as a Jew. Because that's the whole issue. The whole issue is, thought you were a Jew, and you're kind of violating the traditions of Judaism. And so as he begins this defense, because he's got 70 Supreme Court guys of Israel, and so as he begins this, he says, "Brothers, we're brothers. I'm a Jew like you are." And so then he says something. He says, "I've lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day." Now, Paul, and we're going to talk about what a conscience is in a minute. Paul consistently claimed this, that as far as Paul was considered, or as far as he considered himself, Paul thinks he consistently had a good, clean conscience before God. That's the way he approached it. And so, as a matter of fact, if you look at the epistles that Paul wrote, about 23 times he refers to his conscience. And he says, I had a good conscience. In other words, what Paul says is, this is Paul's words. I'm paraphrasing Paul's words. I don't think anything I've done has violated my the will of God that's revealed to us in Judaism. So Paul said, I've got a good conscience. Everything I've done is in line with what God has said. I've done nothing wrong. The Hebrew scriptures, everything we've been taught, the Messianic views, everything that I've done aligns with that. And I have a clear conscience in that. So look at verse 2. Watch what happened. The high priest Ananias, a different one than earlier, it's a different Ananias. The high priest Ananias commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth, to hit him in the mouth. So he says, I have a good conscience. I didn't do anything that violated our Judaism, and I feel good before God with that. And I said, somebody punch him. And we're going to talk about why in just a minute. But let me tell you what there's a weird view sometimes of a conscience. Some people think a conscience is the voice of God. It is not. That's not what a conscience is. I preached a sermon one time years ago on our series of sermons that I may do again here about things that are not in the Bible, that people think are. One of them is let your conscience be your guide. Your conscience is not God speaking to you. That's not where your conscience is. Your conscience is part of your mind that's programmed by your upbringing, by the training you've had, by the propaganda you've seen, your life's experiences. So everything that you have been taught, everything that you have been instilled in you by your propaganda, by your values, even by your religion, maybe, that's your conscience. And your conscience, that part of you that has these values and understanding, kind of lets you know when you're getting away from what you've always been taught. It's not the same thing as the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit will convict you, but He doesn't do it through your conscience. All right? So there's a difference. Now, look what Paul says. Paul said, in my conscience, I've always been a good Jew. I regret nothing. My following Jesus, my going to the Gentiles, my preaching to these people, I feel like that all these were in line with what we've been taught. And then Ananias said, I need somebody to hit him, hit him in the mouth. Why did that statement draw such a violent response from Ananias, who is the high priest? Because he's got Sadducees here, he's got Pharisees in here. They're examining Paul about his Judaism. In other words, why are you going to Gentile people and giving them the gospel without letting them be Jews first? And when Paul said, my conscience is clear on this, they hit him in the mouth. Here's why. They probably, I think, most assuredly saw Paul as a turncoat Jew. He's a traitor. And so when Paul claimed that he's lived his life with a good conscience before God, it infuriated him. Because the way Paul's lived his life is not the way the Pharisees and Sadducees lived their life. And so when Paul said, I'm fine with God, and God's okay with what I did, it incensed them. It made them mad. Now, Ananias was a Sadducee. And Ananias and the rest of these guys already had their mind made up about Paul. It's not one of those kangaroo court things. And so they think that Paul is automatically guilty, especially the Sadducees. There's four groups of Judaism. One's the Pharisees. They're kind of the most well-known. Then the Sadducees. And then there are some Zealots, of which Judas was one. And then there are some Essenes. And the Essenes lived out in Qumran, out in the desert, and they were scribes. All their job was to copy Scripture. That's all they did. And they lived out in the, legitimate desert. So the ones that really ruled Jerusalem, that really controlled Judaism, were the Pharisees and Sadducees. Let me show you how this is setting up. Ananias, the chief priest, the high priest, is a Sadducee. Paul's a Pharisee. And so they don't like each other anyway. Pharisees and Sadducees always did not get along. There's one big controversial doctrine that they disagreed on. And Paul's going to use that to his advantage. So Ananias, when they brought him in, he said, well, you're a Pharisee. I already know you're bad. You're a guilty guy. And so then Paul starts talking about everything I've done, God's approved of. It made Ananias mad, so he said, somebody have to strike him. We got to shut him up. So this is kind of what's going on. Now, Ananias, this particular high priest, became the high priest in about 47 A.D. It's not the same high priest as in the Gospels. This is a different one. That Josephus, who is a first century Jewish historian that gives us a lot of extra biblical evidence about the Bible, he says, in his words, this Ananias was in his words, a despicable person. He's a bad dude. Because when people brought tithes into the sanctuary, into the temple, a lot of those tithes were distributed out to the local priest. Because they're out doing all the work and all that. This Ananias, the chief priest, he seized all that. And so when people brought tithes to the local church, he'd take it all for himself. He was known to take bribes to the Romans, give bribes to the Romans, bribe other Jews. He's a bad guy. He was very wealthy because of his office. and he resorted to violence a lot. And so when he gets called in, and they said there's a dispute in Jerusalem, we cannot have a dispute in Jerusalem. The Jews have to maintain some semblance of peace there because the Romans are going to get real mad. If there's an insurrection in Rome, the Romans are going to blame the Jews, even though it wasn't technically the Jews, but Paul was one. And so Ananias is like, we gotta nip this in the bud quick, So that's why he's so mad. Now look at verse 3. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Do you sit to try me according to the law, and in violation of the law, order me to be struck? So in Jewish law, because Paul's a Jew, Paul's going to claim Jewish law, he's going to claim Roman law. He fits under both. And so it's just like our system. In Jewish law, somebody is innocent until they're proven guilty. But Ananias punished Paul before the verdict. And so that's what Paul's talking about in verse 3. In other words, who are you to do this? I haven't been tried and convicted yet, and you're already finding me guilty and torturing me. A whitewashed wall, it's the same thing as Jesus calling them a whitewashed sepulcher. It's a building on the outside that looks good, but on the inside it's in disrepair. And so Paul says, well, you guys are. On the outside you look fine. On the outside you look holy and righteous and legal and all that, but inside you guys are rotten. Inside you're bad news. And so this is how this progresses. It's not going so well for Paul. He's already got beat, and now he's drug in before the Sanhedrin, and they're about to do worse to him. So look at verse 4. But the bystanders said, do you revile God's high priest? So Paul smarted off to Ananias, the high priest, and Paul said, who you think you are? You're just a whitewashed wall. And then the people standing around said, I dare you talk to the chief priest like that. So what does that tell us? It could be several things. Because this guy, this high priest, comes in, orders Paul to be struck. Paul snaps at him, disrespects him to the bystander. And the bystander says, why are you treating a high priest like that? Paul had not been in Jerusalem for an extended period of time for the past 20 years. So there's a couple of things that could have happened here. Number one, Paul might not even recognize who he was. He may not even knew he was the high priest. And that could have been for a couple of reasons. He may not, because this is not a sanctioned official Sanhedrin council. It's an emergency meeting that Claudius called. So Ananias may not have had his high priestly robes on. And so Paul couldn't tell the difference. That could have been what happened. It could have been that Paul was looking in another direction, and Ananias is over here, and he gave the order to strike him, and Paul didn't know who said it. It could have been that Paul had poor eyesight and just couldn't see him. Just couldn't tell. It could have been that Paul was speaking in irony. Paul may have been saying, it's hard for me to believe that a guy that's representing God could violate the law like this. It could have been. It could have been that Paul just lost his temper. It could have been that Paul was just apologizing. There's a lot of reasons, but they get on to him because they said you're disrespecting the high priest. And who knows why he did that. But look at verse 5. And so Paul said, I was not aware, brethren, that he was a high priest. For it's written, you should not speak evil of a ruler of your people. And so he quotes Exodus 22:28. And so maybe he's apologizing. Maybe he's saying, I didn't know. I didn't know it was him. Because the high priest is the ruler of the Jews in a higher sense than the rest of those Sanhedrin. All these other Sanhedrin are in there, but the high priest kind of reigns above them. And so Paul may have just been saying, I'm sorry, I didn't know. Who knows? But here's one thing that's evident if you look at verse 6. But perceiving that one group were Sadducees and other Pharisees, Paul began crying out in the council, "Brethren, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I am on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead." Paul could see immediately that he's not going to get a fair trial. There's no way. The high priest that he just insulted is a Sadducee. Paul's a Pharisee. This group is made up of mostly Pharisees. And these Sadducees, the Pharisees, man, they really, one sat on one side of the synagogue, the other one sat on another side of the synagogue, and their worship services consisted of them arguing with each other and aggravating each other. What's the number one thing they argued about? The resurrection. The number one thing they didn't agree on was the legitimacy of a resurrection. The Sadducees did not believe it was possible that nobody would be resurrected, not even the Messiah. The Pharisees believed that bodily resurrection was possible. They would have believed that somebody like Lazarus could be resurrected. They would believe that the Messiah would be resurrected. The Sadducees did not. And so watch what Paul did. Paul's like, I can't get a fair trial in here. And so he immediately said, I'm just going to turn them on each other. And so he said, hey guys, I'm a Pharisee of the Pharisees, and I'm here defending the resurrection, because immediately what's going to happen? Pharisees are going to be on his side, at least as far as that goes. And the Sadducees are not. So for just a minute, actually for this whole episode, they're going to forget about Paul for a minute, and they're going to start arguing with each other, because Paul turned them against each other because of that doctrine. The issue of the hope and the resurrection of the dead was fundamental in Paul's case. That's what he's preaching, that Jesus was the Messiah. He was dead, he was buried, he rose again. The resurrection gave us hope. That's the fundamental basis of Paul's preaching. And the Sadducees didn't want to hear any bit of it. And so Paul uses that to drive a wedge in the Sanhedrin. He's pretty sharp. Look at verse 7. As he said this, there occurred a dissension between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. It's exactly what he wanted. Verse 8, for the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. So Luke gives us the definition of the two groups. The Sadducees says that there's no existence of good angels, there's no existence of evil spirits, there's no existence of a resurrection from the dead, and the Pharisees believed in all those things. And so Paul's like, I'm fixing to get killed here. These people they're mad at me, and they're combined. You know, those groups don't like each other, but they hate Paul worse. And so Paul just drove a wedge in between them. He said, let y'all fuss it out. You know, you stay off me for a minute. Which I guess is pretty shrewd. You know, you turn the two sides against each other, and that's what he does. So look at verse 9. And there occurred a great uproar, and some of the scribes of the Pharisaic party stood up and began to argue heartily, saying, we find nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him. And as a great dissension was developing, the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them, and ordered the troops to go down, take him away from them by force, and bring him into the barracks. The barracks is the Antonia fortress. And so that's exactly kind of what Paul wanted. The Pharisees sided with Paul, because Paul said, I'm here to defend the resurrection, you know, the hope of the resurrection. Because even the Pharisees knew that the Messiah would be raised from the dead. And so Paul brings all this up, and the Sadducees start arguing, that's not right, that's blasphemy, that's bad. Then the Pharisees start arguing with them, and the commander, that Claudius, he sees what's going on, and he thinks somebody's just going to tear Paul to pieces. So he gets the troops to go there and get Paul, drag him out of the assembly, and take him to the fortress, to the Antonia fortress. And so as Paul's being led away, I don't know if he's got a grin on his face or not, but he's being taken out of this place where they're about to kill him, and he's going to go be protected by the Roman cohort, and those two groups are still in the council room arguing. That's what's just transpired here. Because the doctrinal issue was huge. And they're not just discussing it. Luke says there's a great dissension. It's really getting ugly. And that's why Claudius, he never could see what Paul did wrong. As far as he knows, Paul is just an innocent guy caught up in a lot of religious mumbo-jumbo. And so he don't want Paul to get killed, so he drags him out and lets the other groups kind of fuss it out. So look at verse 11. Because in the middle of all this, Paul's got to be nervous. So what's God have to do? Reassure him. Look at verse 11. But on that night, immediately following, because Paul's probably thinking, how am I going to get out of this mess? You know, I'm being led away to the fortress. These people still want to kill me. But on that night, immediately following, the Lord stood at his side and said, take courage, for as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, you must witness at Rome also. So God spoke to Paul, and Paul's like, I don't know how I'm going to get out of this one. And God speaks to him, locked up in the fortress, and he said, Paul, don't worry about it. You were a great witness in Jerusalem. You're going to do the same thing in Rome. In other words, you're not going to die right here in Jerusalem. You still get to go to Rome. So I'm sure that somebody with Paul's faith, I'm sure he had a lot of comfort in that, because God has just assured him that Jerusalem wasn't going to be his end. He gets to go to Rome. And so he said, be courageous. You're going to be a witness to me. You're going to testify to me in Rome. And in Rome, as he goes further towards Rome, he's going to go higher and higher up the food chain. And he's going to talk to higher ranking officials, which is what God wants him to do. And so now look at verse 12. Because verse 12 through verse 24 is a plot. Luke's going to tell us about a plot. and we'll see how he gets out of it. But let's take the first three verses, 12 through 15. When it was day, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who formed this plot. They came to the chief priests and the elders and said, we have bound ourselves under solemn oath to taste nothing until we have killed Paul. Now, therefore, you and the council notify the commander to bring him down to you as though you were going to determine his case by more thorough investigation. And we, for our part, are ready to slay him before he comes near this place. So Paul's enemies, the Jews, that's his enemies, the Jewish people, they made an agreement, 40 of them, and they said, we're not going to eat or drink again till this man's dead. We'll make a solemn oath to each other. We'll just fast until Paul is killed. And so look at their plan. They go back to Claudius. He's got him locked up in the Antonia fortress. So they go back to Claudius and they say to Claudius, here's what we need you to do. Go tell Paul and the soldiers that the council's decided to rehear his case. You know, we've all calmed down. We're all good now. We're on the same page. We need to try this guy. So y'all go get him and tell him he's coming back to be judged by us. And on the way, we're going to have some assassins set up on the road, and we're going to jump him and kill him before he ever makes it back to the council. So that's the plan. And so they're going to go and tell Claudius this, that he is going to be assassinated. I guess they think Claudius is going to go along with it because Claudius really doesn't care. I mean, he's a Roman. He didn't care, except that he can't really figure out what Paul did that's made him so mad, because he's not a religious guy. Now, verse 16 is a verse you may have never really considered. Look at verse 16. But the son of Paul's sister, how many of you knew Paul had a sister and a nephew? But the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, and he came and entered the barracks and told Paul. So Paul's nephew, and there's some dispute over the age of the nephew, and honestly, I don't know. I have a guess, but there's two verses back to back that leads you to believe different things. So Paul's nephew hears what the Jews are going to do, because he's in Jerusalem, evidently. And so he goes to the prison. Now, Paul being in prison, he's locked up. He can't come and go as he pleases. He got him locked up for his safety. But as a Roman citizen, he gets privileges, like visitors. And so he's sitting in his jail cell, and they say, you got a visitor. He looks up at his nephew there. And so his nephew comes in and says, hey, Uncle Paul, they're going to kill you, man. Don't leave. You know, they're going to tell you they're bringing you back to be judged, but that's not the plan. The plan is they're going to jump you and kill you, so don't do that. You know, just stay away. Now look at verse 17. Paul called one of the centurions, one of the soldiers, and said, lead this young man to the commander, for he has something to report to him. So evidently Paul's got favor with the Roman centurions, because Paul says, hey, I need a favor. You know, and he says, okay, what's your favor? Take this young man. Now, young man, typically in Greek, means somebody at least 20 years old. So if you read this, you say, okay, Paul's nephew's about 20 years old or so. And so Paul says, take this guy, take him down to the commander, because he's got some news. You know, he's going to tell Claudius not to let my Uncle Paul go, because they're going to kill him along the way. Look at verse 18. So he took him and led him to the commander and said, Paul the prisoner called me and asked me to lead this young man to you, since he had something to tell. Look at verse 19. The commander took him, the young lad, by the hand. Typically, you don't take a 20-year-old by the hand. So that verse leads you to believe he's a younger kid. So how old was Paul's nephew? From the context, we have no idea. He could have been 20 or older, or he could have been 12 or 13. You know, who knows? But he hears, goes to Paul, tells Paul. Paul says, hey, do me a favor, take this guy to the commander. And so now the nephew's going to go to Claudius. You see how it's unfolded? So look at verse 19. The commander took him by the hand, and stepping aside, began to inquire of him privately, what is it that you have to report? Verse 20, he said, the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down tomorrow to the council, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more thoroughly about him. So do not listen to them. For more than 40 of them are lying in wait for him, who have bound themselves under a curse, not to eat or drink until they slay him. And now they are ready and waiting for the promise from you. So they said, we've made a vow not to eat or drink till we kill him. This guy, the nephew, said they're under a curse. They're bound by this murderous curse. They got a very vengeful plot. So now we got to figure out if the commander takes his word or not. So look at verse 23. Or actually verse 22. So the commander let the young man go, instructing him, tell no one that you have notified me of these things. So you go, but don't tell anybody I know. Verse 23. And he called to him 2 of the centurions and said, get 200 soldiers ready by the 3rd hour of the night to proceed to Caesarea with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen. This is big. This is a big deal. This is not the first time Paul's going to have to escape a city by night. Even Claudius knows this man's not going to survive Jerusalem. You know, I don't know what they're going to do to him when they get him, but he's not going to survive. And so he calls 2 of his centurion, and he's going to leave from Jerusalem, and they're going to take him north to Caesarea. Caesarea is up where Herod's fortress used to be, or it was at that time. It's ruins now. And look at what he gives him. He calls 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen. The word spearmen, it's a Greek word that it's hard to translate number-wise. It could be this could be either 270 or 470, depending how you translate that word. So Paul is going to be under escort of at least 270 Roman soldiers. And they're tasked with taking him up to Caesarea. As a matter of fact, if you look at verse 24, they were also to provide mounts to put Paul on. They even give Paul his own horse. And so they're taking care of him. They're going to take him to Caesarea, and they're going to to take care of it. So, let's see. In verse 25, and he wrote a letter having this form, Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. It's the first time Claudius's name's been mentioned. We know who he is by dating the history of the commanders, but this is the first time his number is mentioned, or his name is mentioned. And so he's going to leave. It's the third hour of the night when he leaves. It's 9 p.m. in the night. And like I say, it's the third time Paul's had to leave under the cover of night. It's the third time he's had to escape like that. And so they're going to send him off. Now, look at verse 25, because here's the next leg of this. Claudius writes a letter, verse 27, when this man, this is what he says, when this man was arrested by the Jews and was about to be slain by them, I came up to them with troops and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. Not necessarily, I mean, I guess it's a rescue. It's more of an arrest, but I guess it's a rescue. But you notice what Claudius is trying to do? He's painting himself in a really good light. He's making himself look better, because who's Felix? He's the governor of the Roman province of Syria that included Judea. He bought the position. As a matter of fact, Felix was a low-class guy, and he was born with nothing. And he bought his way up to be the governor. It's actually the old position Pontius Pilate used to have. And now Felix is the governor of Syria, of Judea. And so he's Claudius's boss. And if Felix knows that Paul's a Roman citizen, he's been mistreated, Felix is not going to be very happy with Claudius. So Claudius said, hey, I found the Jews about to kill him. I rescued him. You know, not that I arrested him, I rescued him. You know, I'm a good guy in this story, you know, and I'm sending him to you. So look at verses 28 through 30. Here's the crux of this. I learned that he was a Roman, and I wanted to ascertain the charge for which they were accusing him. I brought him down to the council, and I found him to be accused over questions about their law, but under no accusation deserving death or imprisonment. When I was informed that there would be a plot against this man, I sent him to you at once, also instructing his accuser to bring charges against him before you. In other words, here's his conclusion. Paul's not guilty of anything. There's a religious dispute. For some reason, they're mad at him, but I didn't find anything that warrant him being killed. And so I rescued him, and I brought him to you, because you're the next stage up. And I told the Jews that wanted to accuse him to come before you. In other words, I'm going to pass the buck. I'm not going to deal with it. It's too volatile for me. I'm going to pass it to you, because you're the governor. I'll let you do it. So that's what's going on at this point. Now look at verse 31. I'm sorry. So the soldiers, in accordance with their orders, took Paul, brought him by night to Antipatris, as a city on the way to Caesarea. But the next day, leaving the horsemen to go on with him, they returned to the barracks. When these had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. So this 270 plus Roman soldiers delivered Paul up the Judean countryside, up the hill, through the Bible calls them foothills. They go up to the foothills, and they go to Antipatris. It's about 37 miles northwest of Jerusalem, and they drop him off there, and they return back to the fortress, and they send just a few 70 actually cavalrymen that remain. They send them on to Caesarea. And so Paul's going down to Caesarea. When he gets to Caesarea, who's living in Caesarea? Felix. As we're going to meet Felix. And so when we get to chapter 24, it's Paul now having to defend himself before Felix. He makes a defense before the Jews. Then he makes a defense before the council. Now he's going to make a defense before Felix. He's just working his way up the Roman ladder. Now look at, to wind this up, look at verse 33. When these had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. When he had read it, he asked from what province, thank you, Dwight. When he had read it, he asked from what province he was, and when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I'll give you a hearing after your accusers arrive also, giving orders for him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. So Paul's going to stay in Caesarea until the Jews come up. And then they had this big showdown before Felix. But notice what he says. He's going to keep him in Herod's praetorium. He's a prisoner. He's still a prisoner. And so this is what's going to happen. In chapter 24, 25, and 26, 3 chapters, Luke is going to devote to talking about Paul in Caesarea. And he's going to be going before Felix, and he's going to give this defense before Felix. In chapter 25, he's going to meet another guy on this hierarchy named Festus, and he's going to give his defense before Festus. And then in 26, you know this one, he's going to give a defense before Agrippa. And so he is going to give these defenses where he also is going to share the gospel. And Agrippa's most famous because Agrippa's going to be the one that says, hey, you almost persuaded me to be one of you. I almost accepted Christ. But he didn't. So Paul is just going through, because he's got to get to Rome. That's where he's going. He's going to Rome. But he's got to get there. So Luke has given us the detailed journey. He's before the Jews. Then he's before basically Claudius, I guess. And then he goes before the Sanhedrin Council. And now we're going to see him before Felix, and then Festus, and then Agrippa. And he's going to continue to try to defend himself. Basically, the claim is still going to be that he's a bad Jew. And so he's got to defend himself. But he turns that around and says, not only am I a bad Jew, I mean, still a traditional Jew, but I'm a completed Jew, and you need to be one too. So that's where all this is going. Any questions about chapter 23? Anybody? And even though he's a prisoner, he's going to be fairly comfortable because he's a Roman citizen and he hadn't had a trial yet, so we're going to keep him comfortable. And I'll tell you this about Felix. Not only is he low class, he was a former slave. And so he is the first former slave to ever be the governor of Syria in their history. Anybody? All right, we can sign off with our online group. I appreciate